And so, as we come into chapter 17 of Revelation, we're introduced again to another almost sort of fantastical vision from John, this woman on this beast. And we'll see how, as I said before, how this chapter flows on into chapter 18 and 19, both of which start, "After this I heard, after this I saw." And we see too how chapter 17 flows on out of chapter 16. So it's one of the seven angels who we were introduced to in chapter 16. And as we look at this vision from our own time and our own perspective, it's easy for us to read more into it than John ever intended. So, what is it that John is wanting his readers then to see and understand? And what is it then for ourselves we're able to draw from that? An overview, firstly, we see that this figure of a woman, a prostitute, one who then and still today leads people away from faithful commitment. It is also identified as Babylon and the great city that rules over the earth. And we've seen before how John uses this symbolically to describe this sort of worldly and so opposite to spiritual system of rule. That sort of system which is humanistic at its center, no room for God or his values or absolutes. This worldly system opposed to God, which John identified as Rome in his time, also identifies it as Babylon, as do other gospel writers or New Testament writers. And it challenges us to consider, what is it in our time? That is this sort of worldly system. What is it in our time? Some have said the greatest temptation that we all face in our time is how in the West we have been led to believe that personal safety and affluence are the two most important things that we should seek to have, and that the state, the government, seeks to provide. And we see, and we're seeing, how when these two things, personal safety and affluence, are challenged or threatened, we see how people react. Whether that's stockpiling, rushing to fill up, challenging the government's got to pay us for this or compensate us for that. And so this woman represents, for John's day, the worldly, the ungodly system of economics, politics, and social order. And then through the chapter, we'll see very briefly, John tells us a number of things about living or trying to live without God. So how this system works, as it were. Now, I'm just going to go through them really briefly because otherwise it would take forever, but we can open them out in discussion later on if people want to. And the first thing we see in verses 1 to 5 about this system is it is seductive, attractive, tempting at first glance, and it will draw you in. The woman is dressed in purple, expensive cloth. She's decked with gold and precious stones. It looks good. It promises much. This system is seductive and attractive. But then we also see that this worldly system will mock the church and celebrate its apparent weakness and failings. And we see that in verse 6, drunk on the blood of the saints. Now, this isn't to say the church should be proud. Our history shows the horrors of being seduced by this worldly, this ungodly system. When we see, historical abuse and all sorts of things within the church. But what it reminds us as God's people today, we must never be ashamed of our apparent weakness. For as Paul says, when I am weak, you are strong. But weakness should lead us to stand firm and not to give in, not to think that what we have, it would be better if we replaced it with this or that, if that makes sense. John then goes on to show us in verses 6 to 8 that this worldly system will not give up easily. Like a lot of celebrities today, a lot of politicians and political parties today, how we see them keep on sort of reinventing themselves to stay in power or to stay sort of popular. We read in verses 6 to 8, the beast once was, now is not, and will come again. It's not easy. It's not going to easily give up. And we see that sort of repeated and reiterated in verses 9 and 10 as we see these kings who have ruled, rule, and yet will rule in the future. This idea of just not letting go. But then in verses 11 to 14, John shows us that although powerful, influential, seductive, convincing, etc., although the godless world is all of these things and more, John says, you who are God's people, take heart, for the Lord will overcome. And we've seen how that's a recurring theme through all of this letter, that even though as God's people then and still today, we may feel sort of downtrodden. We haven't really got a response to the worldly system. It tempts us to let go of our faith, etc., etc. John says, stand firm, for the Lord will overcome. Don't give up. Don't give in. Hold fast to your faith in God through Christ, for by doing so, you will receive God's gift of eternal life. For as we see in the closing verses of the chapter, this worldly system, this godless system, will not last. This system which places humanity at its center, it will self-destruct. And John says, tucked away in the middle of all of this chapter, this calls for a mind with wisdom. And I guess that challenges us today. Do we stop to see, to notice the signs of our times? Do we see how the godless sort of social, political, economic systems are working to tempt people, to promise people much, but in the long term will deliver little if nothing? Can we see what it is that tempts us to let go of our faith? And do we know what it is that we're holding on to so that we can make sure